From swords and guns to nukes and killer robots, humans throughout history have excelled at one thing above all others: finding creative new ways to murder the living hell out of each other. This is a whirlwind tour through some of the deadliest and most influential weapons in human history, century by century. Some of these weapons were invented in the centuries we spotlight them in. Others are classics that just never went out of deadly style. First century, the Roman Gladius. Let's start our list with a good old-fashioned sword, and one that was beloved by one of the most successful military cultures in human history, the ancient Romans. Over time, the gladius became a catch-all term for swords throughout the Roman Empire, but we are specifically talking about the Fulham Gladius, the iconic triangle-tipped sword introduced in 43 AD during the Roman invasion of Britain. The sword is simple and effective, a handy all-purpose blade that assisted the legionnaires in many a conquest and also became an enduring symbol of the Roman Empire itself, remaining the go-to weapon until the end of the 1st century. It's impossible to see one without picturing the culture that wielded it, and it became a symbol of fear for Rome's many enemies. But it's nowhere near as brutal as our offering from the next 100 years. 2nd century, Daan Fols. Historical military development has often been an endless arms race between weapons and armor, offense and defense. And under Roman rule, the gold standard of armor was the lorica segmentata, the classic segmented Roman armor you've seen in everything from Gladiator to The Life of Brian. The superior tactics, equipment, and size of the Roman legion often led to them utterly dominating whatever forces they went up against. But some of those forces fought back hard. Take, for example, the Dacians, an Indo-European culture that inhabited the Carpathian Mountains. They famously used a sword with a curved sickle-like end known as the falx. And according to the records of Roman military leaders at the time, the falx was incomparable at slicing through the lorica segmentata like it was wet toilet paper. And because the 16-inch blade was only sharp on one side, the Dacians channeled all of their energy into brutal hacking strikes that left their enemies bleeding to death on the dirt of the battlefield. But if the 2nd century gave us the falx, the 3rd gave us a version that's even deadlier. 3rd century, Iberian Falcata. Not only does the Falcata look absolutely badass, it's also another weapon that made the Romans nervous, which is no mean feat. It incorporates the curved edge of the falx, but with a sharp point, making it useful for both hacking and stabbing, something that the Iberian mercenaries who wielded it absolutely loved to do. The Falcata was made out of high-quality Carpathian iron, making it even deadlier than its Dacian predecessor. Despite this and the fact that there are records of it being used in as early as the 5th century BC, the Falcata still remains pretty obscure in the scope of history. The same cannot be said for our terrifying 4th century weapon. 4th century, Maquawit. The Aztecs were one of the most badass civilizations that ever walked the earth. From their death gods to their giant human sacrifice ziggurats, it's clear the Aztec warriors are not to be messed with. They were only defeated in the end by more technologically advanced armies wielding weapons that we'll get to later in the list. So what weapon helped elevate the status of the Aztec warriors to the scariest dudes in the room? Folks, meet the Maquawit, which reigned in the Americas from 900 BC to 1600 AD, with the 4th century sitting neatly in the middle. But if you're meeting the Maquawit in person, well, we hope that your family has a copy of your last will and testament. The weapon is simple, but ruinously effective. It's a long, flat piece of wood with impossibly sharp obsidian blades hammered into the sides. A single strike from this bad boy wielded by a trained Aztec warrior, you're mincemeat. The weapon was so feared that some claimed it could even decapitate a horse with a single strike. An actual horse. Was that true? Probably not. But it gives you an idea of just how feared the weapon was. Though, fun fact, an Aztec warrior who killed too many of his opponents was considered a failure. The true objective for a seasoned Aztec was to capture his enemies alive, so they could later be sacrificed properly in a ceremony. The one drawback of the Maquawit is that you still need to be up close to use it. The deadliest weapon of the 5th century? Not so much. 5th century, the Hun Recurve Bow. The Aztecs were some scary dudes, but even they might have started running if they ever saw Attila the Hun and his culture of hyper-masculine nomadic warriors riding over the hill like a bat out of hell. While they had a reputation as mindless, kill-crazy barbarians to their foes, the Huns were actually tactical geniuses, eager to make use of state-of-the-art weapons to assist in their endless quest to pillage and conquer. One of the most dangerous of all these weapons was the Recurve Bow. Bows have been with mankind for about as long as we've kept records, but the Recurve Bow held some unique advantages over many of its predecessors. The curve of the bow allowed it to store more energy for the strike than an equivalent straight bow, and its smaller size made it ideal for mounted archers like the Huns, who could rout their enemies on horseback and pincushion them with arrows before they even knew what was happening. Ranged weapons always have been and always will be terrifying and formidable, but that doesn't mean the next few centuries wouldn't bring us some equally deadly melee offerings. 6th century, Spata. Here come swords off the top rope! Because some inventions, we basically got it right the first time and we just need to give them little tweaks here and there. The Spata was a sword favored by mounted soldiers and heavy infantry, similar in design to the classic Gladius, but longer and heavier, making it even more dangerous to be on the business end of. One of the greatest strengths of the Roman Empire was their tendency to appropriate some of the most effective aspects of other cultures that they encountered and in many cases conquered. The Romans learned of the Spata from the Celtic mercenaries during the Second Punic War, and they quickly adopted it, gradually replacing the classic Gladius and making the Roman soldiers who wielded it even deadlier. But at least it can't burn you to death, right? I'm sure the 7th century will help us with that one. 7th century, Byzantine Greek fire. Also known, at least by us, as ye olde napalm. Greek fire is one of the most terrifying and enigmatic weapons of the 7th century and beyond. Just like Grandma's cookies, the recipe was a closely guarded secret, but most modern historians agree that it was likely a mixture of highly flammable petroleum and a concoction of sticky resins. It was most commonly used by the Byzantine soldiers during nautical warfare, setting alight enemy ships and the unfortunate sailors on them. The Greek fire could be deployed in primitive grenades and even rudimentary flamethrowers. Much like napalm, Greek fire would stick to its victims, slowly and horrifically burning them to death. We're probably lucky that we lost the recipe for a while on this one. But one thing you can never lose is the cold, hard, sharp edge of a blade. And what's scarier than a blade wielded by an 8th century samurai? 8th century, Naginata. The Naginata is essentially a katana on the end of a staff, one of the most iconic and terrifying polearms in history. It was popular among the samurai, Japanese foot soldiers, and even the Onamusha, an order of warrior women who became active in the Kamakura period. The weapon is so integral to a certain type of warrior that it has its own fighting style, Naginata Jutsu, which is still practiced in Japan as a sport to this day. Whether you're impaling a fellow soldier, cleaving pitiful foes from the back of your warhorse, or skewering cavalrymen like the Yakitori, there are few warriors who can match a samurai with a Naginata. Except maybe a bloodthirsty 9th century berserker with a Dane axe. Speaking of which, 9th century, Dane axe. The Vikings are another infamous warrior culture that left their mark in history with bloodstains and piles of hacked up bodies, and some of their most feared and revered warriors wielded the Dane axe, a large, one-sided battle axe with a broad, thin blade. This thin edge, constructed out of harder steel than the rest of the axe, made for incredibly powerful strikes that could cleave often fatal wounds into the bodies of their enemies, from foot soldiers to cavalrymen. Some Dane axes were used as status symbols, reaching heights of 1.7 meters. Someone's overcompensating. In terms of function, the Dane axe is kind of like a giant, long-handled meat cleaver, and whoever the Vikings were going after was little more than a slab of dead meat on the cutting board. But with our 10th century weapon, you could at least ensure that your dead meat was well cooked. 10th century, Chinese fire arrows. From the Hun recurve bow, we know arrows are dangerous. From Byzantine Greek fire, we know that fire is dangerous. What if we fused them? Some mad lad in the 10th century China did just that. Chinese fire arrows are remembered as one of the first gunpowder weapons to ever hit the battlefields. The small bags of gunpowder were attached to arrows acting as an incendiary. Not only would this inflict burning damage on their opponents, they'd also get a psychological edge from the initial explosion. While this was one of the most advanced weapons of the time, Chinese military technicians were going to make some incredible advancements over the next few centuries, starting with this next one. 11th century, the fire lance. If this was a contest for weapons with the most badass name, then fire lances would win, hands down. But even if it had a lamer name, this would still be an incredible advancement in military technology. It was essentially a powerful firework on the end of a polearm, which could be directed at a close-range enemy and fired. As the yearly statistics for 4th of July injuries and deaths can tell you, having a firework blasted at your face definitely is not good for your health. But the fire lance was even more dangerous. The rocket was full of pellets that would be sprayed by the explosion like a frag grenade or a shotgun blast. With a range of 3 meters, the fire lance would rarely end a fight, but it made for a fantastic way to put enemies off balance before engaging in melee. The next weapon, however, would be wasted on mere foot soldiers. It can take down whole castles. 12th century, the Counterweight Trebuchet. Okay, we're cheating a little bit on this one. There isn't a broad consensus on when exactly the Counterweight Trebuchet was first created, but it was definitely active during this time, and it was described by some as the most powerful weapon of the Middle Ages. So what made this siege weapon so powerful? For context, siege warfare sucks. Whether you're doing the sieging or getting sieged, before the era of siege weapons, it was almost always a war of attrition, waiting out the people inside the encampment to run out of resources and get desperate enough to surrender. The Counterweight Trebuchet, capable of firing huge projectiles at castles or other fortresses, sped the process along. The design of the trebuchet allowed it to fire significantly larger projectiles than the standard catapult, and it didn't involve a close-up risk of a siege tower or a battering ram. When your enemies had a trebuchet, it didn't matter if you had a fortress anymore. But like we said earlier, these next few centuries were where China was really coming into its own. Just wait until you see what they got for us next. 13th century, Quocha rocket launchers. This isn't even just one weapon, but a handful of different weapons built off of China's earlier advancements with gunpowder. First were the fire arrows, then the fire lances, and now rocket carts and the nest of bees. The rocket cart was a rudimentary mounted multiple rocket launcher. As the name suggests, it's a rollable cart with multiple mounted gunpowder rockets designed to go out at once and light up a large number of enemies, or an enemy fortress in front of them. Fans of Totally Accurate Battle Simulator will be very familiar with this one. Then there's the nest of bees, a hexagonal basket filled with gunpowder fire arrows, like a more compact version of the rocket cart, but every bit as chaotic and deadly. But even as gunpowder exploded, metaphorically and literally across the East, the West was showing that sometimes you just can't beat an old classic. 14th century, English longbow. At face value, it doesn't look like much, but the English longbow helped English and Welsh soldiers effectively fend off enemies for centuries, including the arguably even better equipped French forces during the 100 Years' War. Measuring around 6 feet in length, you wouldn't see this bow wielded by a mounted Hun archer. These weapons were fast, powerful, and accurate over hundreds of meters. Arrows fired from the English longbow by a trained archer could also easily pierce armor, often leading to fatal results. It's said that many battles in the 100 Years' War were essentially decided by longbowmen, so the importance and deadliness of this weapon in the 14th century cannot be overstated, even if an emerging technology in ranged weaponry was soon going to replace it. 15th century, the European crossbow. It's worth mentioning that crossbows as a concept have been around for a long time, and like a lot of innovations in weaponry, they originated in China. However, as the centuries have drawn on, the humble crossbow has been refined to near perfection. While France's crossbowmen saw defeat against the English longbow in the Battle of Agincourt, the crossbow ended up winning out in the long run, trading reload speed for accuracy and power. So what makes the crossbow deadlier? Simply put, anyone could use it. When it came to the deadliness of the English longbow, that was as much to do with the highly skilled users as the weapon itself. You don't need a lifetime of training to be dangerous with a crossbow. Point, shoot, and watch your target bleed out if you hit anything important. And with this next century, things got even deadlier. 16th century, the Infantry Musket. Picture a knight for a second. Tall, dashing, wearing shiny plate armor with a mighty sword, riding his favorite horse. He is the boss of the battlefield, a noble warrior with impeccable battle training. He doesn't fear arrows, he can parry any blow and cut down his opponent in a flash. He can joust, charge, and knife fight with the best of them. He strides across the battlefield with complete confidence. Then one day he hears an almighty crack. Something hits his armor with incredible force, and suddenly he feels something wet on his skin. He collapses dead before he hits the ground. The man who killed him is halfway across the battlefield, pouring more gunpowder out of a small pouch down the smooth-bore barrel of his musket, and preparing to slot in another tiny iron ball bearing. The age of the night is over, all thanks to the musket, the granddaddy of all modern rifles, which changed the landscape of the battlefield forever. Killing had never been so easy, so thanks to this rudimentary gun, plenty more bodies were about to hit the floor. Now if only someone could do something about that loading mechanism. 17th century, Flint Lock weaponry. While variations of the Flint Lock existed as early as the 16th century, yeah, we saw you typing "well actually" in the comments, put down the keyboard. We're talking about the true Flint Lock mechanism here, introduced to pistols and rifles in the 17th century, and still acting as a mainstay in every piece of pirate media made since then. Widely attributed to French gunsmith Marin Le Bourgeois, the true flintlock mechanism changed the game by adding a vertically operating sear, part of the trigger mechanism that holds back the cock. Okay, don't laugh, that part of the gun was called that because it was shaped like a rooster. Get your minds out of the gutter. The particular construction of this flintlock mechanism, where the cock would release and strike the flint, igniting the gunpowder within and firing the shot, made guns considerably more efficient and reliable, and as a result, a lot more deadly too. But when you needed to reload, well, that was a problem. A problem that the 18th century answered in the most brutal way possible. 18th century, sword bayonet. When it comes to killing opponents at a great distance, you're best off packing a rifle. And when it comes to killing someone up close, history has shown us that you really can't go wrong with a sword. And in the paraphrased words of the great philosopher Hannah Montana, the sword bayonet gives you the best of both worlds, and that makes you twice as deadly in the process. The muzzle-loaded rifles of the Napoleonic Wars could be a nightmare to reload, especially in the heat of the battle, and that could leave you at a serious disadvantage if you found yourself on the wrong side of the enemy lines. A sword bayonet evened the odds, meaning that in a pinch, the rifle could become an equally deadly melee weapon if reloading wasn't feasible. They were so effective that they found use cases amongst the British, Japanese, and Ottoman armies, among others, and ensured that even in the era where you could fire a metal ball bearing through the skull of your enemy at 200 paces, there would still be plenty of intestines spilled on the battlefields. But you know what you don't need to attach a sword to in order to be incredibly deadly? The weapons that the 19th century gave us. 19th century, automatic firearms. Guns, but faster. So elegant, so simple, so deadly. We've spent plenty of words talking about how guns have revolutionized warfare as we know it since the militarization of gunpowder 800 years prior. But the invasion of the percussion cap in this century brought the humble boomstick to new heights of lethality as devastating new weapons like the Gatling gun hit battlefields across the globe. The power of these new machine guns is part of the reason why the American Civil War was such a bloody affair. With over 650,000 casualties, it's still the highest number of fatalities for American troops in any conflict the U.S. has ever been involved in. In the 1880s, things truly got real with the invention of smokeless powder, which in turn led to enterprising weaponsmith Hiram Stevens Maxim to create the Maxim machine gun in 1884, starting the first boom of automatic weapons as we know them today. As time passed, they'd only get deadlier, as they went from multi-person death machines to more compact, efficient weapons that a single person could carry around and wipe out whole crowds of combatants with a single squeeze of the trigger. But what if the next century offered a way to wipe a whole city off the map with the push of a button? 20th century, nuclear weaponry. Now we have become death, the destroyer of worlds. 150,000 obliterated in an instant in Hiroshima, 75,000 in Nagasaki. The deadliest weapon humankind has ever known came to be in the Manhattan Project in 1940s New Mexico, the United States' Hail Mary attempt to get a definitive advantage in the war. And they succeeded. But the result is a terrifying sword of Damocles still hanging over our heads today. And the scariest part? The weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are quaint compared to the nuclear armaments that exist today. In fact, the current standard is around 3,000 times more powerful than the ones that leveled those cities in World War II. As of 2024, there are believed to be just over 12,100 nuclear warheads in the world, at least 3,800 of which are active, spread across 9 nuclear states: the US, Russia, the United Kingdom, China, India, Pakistan, France, Israel, and North Korea. It would only take a fraction of the active quantity to reduce the surface of the world to a superheated, irradiated wasteland where no intelligent life could possibly survive. Lucky for us, world leaders are always reasonable, and they've never done something drastic and irrevocable when they felt backed into a corner. But what if the 21st century gave that decision to something far more dangerous? 21st century, drones and AI. Yep, turns out that AI does have a purpose beyond destroying jobs, making YouTube videos worse, and creating all those weird quasi-religious inspirational images that your grandma keeps liking on Facebook. And that purpose is killing people, lots of them. But how can this tech go from janky videos of Will Smith eating spaghetti to empowering weapons on par with nuclear bombs? Generative Pre-trained Transformers. That's the GPT in ChatGPT, in case you were wondering. They're likely to give autonomous weapon systems like drones a supercharge of industrial revolution proportions. Some have argued that handling air, sea, and ground dominance over to the machines will put fewer flesh and blood soldiers at risk. But when these conflicts spill over into civilian areas, as they always do, we're looking at a true Terminator scenario. Unfeeling killing machines mowing through anything they need to secure their objectives. But it's not just autonomous drones and tanks that we need to worry about. Nuclear weapons are only as dangerous as the person holding the button. And some cybersecurity experts fear that in the not-too-distant future, AI might be playing a sizable role in strategic and tactical assessment. Yes, up to and including whether or not to invoke the nuclear option. And if you're not freaked out by the same technology currently telling people to add Elmer's school glue to their cheese pizzas, also having a hand in nuclear decision-making, then we don't know what to tell you, buddy. Now check out Weapons Even the Military Made Illegal compilation, or watch this instead.